It was a dark and stormy night in the small town of Willow Creek. Sarah, a young woman in her mid-20s, had just moved into an old house on the outskirts of town. This house, left to her by her late grandmother, was reputed among the locals to be haunted. But Sarah, a pragmatic software developer, didn't believe in ghost stories. As the wind howled and lightning streaked across the sky, Sarah settled in for the night. She lit a fire in the old stone fireplace, the warm glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. Curling up with a book, she tried to ignore the creaks and groans of the old house settling around her. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house. Startled, Sarah jumped up and looked around. A picture frame had fallen from the wall. She picked it up and saw it was a photo of her grandmother, taken in this very house. As she stared at the photo, the lights flickered and then died, plunging her into darkness. The storm outside seemed to grow fiercer, its winds whipping against the house. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She fumbled for a flashlight and turned it on, its beam unsteady in her trembling hand. Deciding to check the circuit breaker, she moved through the house, her way lit only by the occasional flash of lightning. The air grew inexplicably cold as she reached the basement door. She hesitated, her instincts screaming for her to turn back, but she pushed on, opening the door. The old wooden stairs creaked ominously under her weight as she descended into the basement. It was cluttered with old furniture and boxes filled with her grandmother's belongings. Sarah's flashlight flickered as she approached the circuit breaker, and then it went out completely, enveloping her in darkness. Panicking, she tried to turn the flashlight back on, but it was no use. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and she could see her breath in the cold air. A feeling of dread washed over her as she heard a whisper, barely audible over the howl of the storm. "Leave!" Terrified, Sarah ran back towards the stairs, but the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening bang. She screamed, pounding on it, but it wouldn't budge. As she turned, lightning illuminated the house, and she saw the silhouette of a figure at the end of the hallway. The figure was an old woman, dressed in a tattered gown, her eyes hollow and dark. She pointed at Sarah, her mouth moving but no sound coming out. Sarah, heart pounding, backed away slowly. The lights flickered back on, and the figure vanished. Heart still racing, Sarah dashed upstairs, locking herself in her bedroom. She stayed awake all night, lights blazing, every small sound making her jump. As dawn broke, she packed her things and left the house, never to return. She realized that some houses are better left alone, especially those that whisper warnings in the storms. Sarah later learned that her grandmother had always been sensitive to the paranormal, something she'd never believed until that night. The town's history revealed that the house had been built on the site of an old asylum, explaining perhaps the restless spirits. Sarah's skepticism had turned into a cautious respect for the unknown, and she decided never to scoff at ghost stories again. The experience had left her with a lingering fear of storms, a reminder of that night when the boundary between the living and the dead had seemed all too thin. It was a late autumn evening, and the last leaves whispered in the crisp breeze as Emily, a 22-year-old art student, arrived at her sleek, modern house nestled in a newly developed suburb. She had just said goodbye to her friends after a small dinner party. The house, with its large glass windows and minimalist design, felt particularly isolated tonight, surrounded by empty lots awaiting future homes. Emily was alone, her parents away on a business trip, and her younger brother at a sleepover. She loved the spaciousness of her house, but tonight, the vast open-plan layout seemed to amplify every little sound, turning the soft closing of a door into a sharp snap. As she settled in the living room, a strange unease took hold of her. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. She tried watching TV to drown out the silence, but the flickering images couldn't dispel the growing feeling that she was being watched. Deciding she needed sleep, Emily headed upstairs to her bedroom, her steps light against the polished concrete floor. The unease followed her, crawling up her spine. As she prepared for bed, the lights flickered, casting her shadow against the wall like a specter. In bed, Emily struggled to fall asleep, her mind alert to every sound. A sudden crash downstairs jolted her awake. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone. No signal. The Wi-Fi was down too. Frightened, but needing to know what happened, she tiptoed down the stairs, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The living room was a mess. A chair was overturned and her art supplies were scattered across the floor as if swept away by a gust of wind. Yet, all the windows were closed, the house sealed tight against the night. As she bent to pick up a scattered paintbrush, a cold whisper brushed her ear. "Leave now." Frozen with fear, Emily turned slowly. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to thicken, coalescing into a dark, humanoid shape. She screamed, throwing the brush at the shadow, but it passed right through and clattered harmlessly to the floor. The shape advanced, and as it did, the temperature plummeted, the breath turning visible in front of her face. Emily backed away, stumbling over the fallen chair, her breaths coming in sharp gasps. She made a break for the front door, but as she ran, her vision blurred, her steps faltered, and darkness edged her sight. She collapsed, her body mere feet from the door, her hands stretched out toward the threshold. The last thing Emily saw was the shadow looming over her, and then everything went black. The next morning, a neighbor out for a jog noticed the front door ajar. Inside, they found Emily, cold and lifeless, her open eyes staring at a destiny she could not escape. The police found no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence of another presence in the house. It was as if the shadows themselves had claimed her. From that day on, the house stood vacant, a modern shell that locals hurried past, whispering about the young girl who had died alone, surrounded by the shadows that had made the sleek glass and concrete their home. Claire had always loved her sleek, high-rise apartment in the city center. It boasted floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the urban skyline. Tonight, however, as a storm gathered, casting the city in a sinister light, her beloved view seemed more menacing than ever. As the clock struck midnight, the power flickered and went out, leaving Claire in darkness, the cityscape her only light source, its eerie glow illuminating her apartment in haunting shades of blue and gray. The wind howled against the glass, making the whole apartment groan under its force. Attempting to calm her nerves, Claire lit some candles and placed them around the living room. Their flicker created dancing shadows on the walls, which twisted and turned as if alive. She tried to settle down with a book, but the sense of unease was palpable, as if the storm outside had seeped into her home. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the room. Claire froze. The windows were sealed. There should be no draft. Her eyes darted around, searching for the source, and that's when she noticed the balcony door slightly ajar, swaying gently. With a deep breath, she walked over to close it, but stopped dead in her tracks. The reflection in the glass didn't show her alone. Behind her stood a figure, draped in dark, wet clothes, hair plastered to its face, obscuring its features but for the eyes, which burned a fierce, unnatural red. Claire spun around, but there was nothing there. No sign of anyone. Heart pounding, she rushed to slam the door shut and lock it. As she turned back, the room seemed darker than before. The candlelight too dim, the shadows too deep. She decided to call her friend, but her phone was dead, even though she had charged it just before the storm. A growing terror took root in her heart. She was not alone. The air grew colder, and her breath formed mist in front of her. Whispers filled the apartment, words indistinguishable, swirling around her, louder and louder, until they were almost deafening. Claire covered her ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside her head, urging her to look out the window. Against her better judgment, she approached the window, peering out into the storm. Lightning flashed, and for a brief moment, she saw figures on the street below, all looking up at her, their eyes red as the figure behind her. She screamed, backing away from the window, stumbling over a candle and sending it crashing to the floor. The fire caught quickly on a curtain, and in seconds, the apartment was ablaze. Trapped and overcome with smoke, Claire collapsed, the last thing she saw being the figure at her balcony door, watching her as the flames engulfed everything around her. Her building stood tall the next morning, untouched by fire, her apartment pristine as if nothing had happened. No one in the building had seen or smelled smoke. but Claire was gone. Her disappearance a mystery, her name added to the list of unexplained vanishings in the city's heart. The apartment remained vacant, the locals whispering of the cursed high-rise, where the storm brings more than just wind and rain. It brings the forgotten back, if only for one night.